Michael Morpurgo, it's been said that everyone has a novel in them. Do you think that's true?
I don't know about a novel, but everyone has a story or a poem. Everyone has a story to tell. I'm convinced of that. I mean, when you talk to young kids, very young kids, and I'm talking about 4 and 5-year-olds, and you've all done it, they'll start off and they'll just go on talking and telling you this story. They have a very natural way of being themselves and telling their tale. What seems to happen as they grow up is that confidence is somehow removed, and very often it's removed because at some point they're told to write these things down. And when you write something down, because of the way we are taught, I think, part of the process seems to become fearful about making mistakes, or is it any good? And the more you ask yourself that question, the more the answer is going to be no. And so it isn't very long, I think, before that little germ of genius that's in, I think, everyone, really. Everyone has something special at their core. I'm completely convinced of this. But it can be crushed very, very easily. And I think the education system, not just in this country, but in many, many countries, does a pretty good job of crushing it.
You were born during the war, and I don't think you met your biological father until the mid-20s in pretty
Well, I didn't meet him, but I didn't know him. I mean,
Okay.
he came back from the Second World War in 1946, I think, when I was 2.5. I remember nothing about him, and I didn't see him for long because my mother had decided that she wanted to be with someone else, whose name was Morpurgo, Jack Morpurgo. And my father did this extraordinary thing, which is kind of would be unheard of today. It would be thought to be terribly wrong. But he decided that he didn't know his 2 sons, that's my elder brother Peter and myself, and we were both tinies, because he'd been away at the war. And I suppose he'd seen us, if he'd seen us for a month all our lives, I'd be surprised. The war took him away. If he had to leave, it was for a weekend or a week or whatever. He didn't know us, and we didn't know him. And so his feeling was, if you want, and said to my mother, if you want to be with this other man, I am not going to hang around and be a sort of a shadow father, because of course I want to know my sons, but I don't want to get in the way. I don't want this to be a trouble and a problem to them. So you bring them up with your new husband, and when they get to an age when they want to make a decision to see me, I will always want to see them. And sure enough, when I got to the age of 21, he came to see us. But before that, I had a really extraordinary moment of seeing him, but not knowing it was him, because we were watching television. I think I was 19, and we were watching black and white television, and it was a dramatization of Great Expectations. And my father was playing Magwitch. And so the first time I saw my father, he reared up from behind a gravestone. And my mother, who was sitting next to me, sort of clapped her hand on it. Oh my God, that's your father. And
you didn't know?
I didn't know. Couldn't recognise him, that's for sure. At least I hoped I couldn't. But what was really interesting was that, of course, it was a time, it's quite difficult to explain. It was at a time when divorce, separation was very shameful. And that my family had hidden. I mean, I knew Jack Morpurgo wasn't my father, but there was never any discussion about the man who had been or was my father. So it was kind of a hidden thing. He was a kind of a ghost father, really, and never mentioned. And suddenly there he was in the television in the middle of the room with my entire step family ranged round. So it was quite a moment. So that's the first time I saw him. He was an escaped convict.
Moving back, did you enjoy your time at school and university?
It varied. I was sent away to I went to primary school, first of all, in London, which was part, I think I mentioned earlier on, part of the fear-inducing. And that happened there. The tests started and the failure started, and from that moment, all the love of stories which I'd been given from my mother through reading to me, that seemed to vanish quite quickly, because words began to be enemies, something I really couldn't cope with and I was frightened of, and you got punished for if you didn't get right. And I just withdrew from them and wanted to go out to play. That's really what I did. And then I think, to better me, they sent me away to a boarding school in Sussex, overlooking Ashdown Forest. It should have been glorious, and indeed the place was extraordinary. But there was also more fear there than before, and now you were getting caned for your misdemeanours and slippered and things like this. So whilst it didn't matter, in the sense that we were all in it together, so everyone was going through the same regime, which is a great comfort. But nonetheless, you lived on your anxiety. And my survival technique was to be good at something that I knew the school liked. And so it kept me out of trouble and gave me status. So I happen to have, I think, a rather modest talent at anything to do with sports, whether rugby or cricket or whatever. So I did manage to survive. The other thing that kept me going was that I developed a love of music. Not playing an instrument, I was hopeless at that, but I could sing. Again, I think I was sort of all right, not brilliant, but I became head chorister and found myself really enjoying singing in a choir. And I think it's partly because of that my stepfather and my mother chose a school for me afterwards that was very musical. So I went to a school called King's School Canterbury in Kent, where the music was extraordinary, and I didn't know it then, but the architecture was extraordinary, the whole history of the place was extraordinary. And there I was also pretty unsuccessful academically. I was very much on the middle to bottom rung, but I got from that school almost the best thing that any school can give you, which is the feeling that when you leave it, you could just about do anything. And that confidence thing is so important, and it's what you need when you leave school. School can be a great comfort. It can envelop you and you feel really good inside it if you've enjoyed it. But there comes that moment when you leave and you're out there, and then you do need that kind of confidence. And I had confidence. I did all the wrong things. I went into the army for a bit, that didn't work. And then I went to be a teacher, and every single thing I tried it to the utmost, thought I was good at it, which I probably wasn't, but you thinking you're good at it helps. And so I ended up going to university in London, where I just about coped academically, got a really bad degree. Mr. Gove now tells us that anyone with a third-class degree shouldn't be a teacher. Well, I've been in teaching and in education one way or another most of my life, so it's not very encouraging. But then so is Philip Pullman, so there you go. He also got a third. I
think on that university, many people are now, with the tripling tuition fees, and they're sort of reconsidering whether an undergraduate degree is actually worth it. So those who want to become novelists or writers, or perhaps in the creative arts, do you think a university education is important for them?
Not particularly. I'm more and more sure that it is. There are those people who cope very well with abstractions, with academia, with studying on your own, all that sort of thing. People who can cope with that and get something out of it and learn a lot about themselves and about the world. You can do that at university. It gives you the space and the time to breathe, to think, to read. That's fantastic. There are equally a large number of people who can in a way have that same time in their life working. And both experiences are very valuable. And the more I see of universities now, which have just multiplied and multiplied and multiplied, I see people going to them because in a way they're almost filling the figures. They're doing what parents expect, what government expect. I mean, for instance, you get a degree in English from wherever, and you think that might lead to a job in publishing, or indeed the first step to becoming a writer. I think you delude yourself. But there are just so many people out there, particularly in the world of the arts, looking to find work with that interest at its heart. And very often, if you want to go into theatre, for instance, you do just as well to become a stage manager, to paint scenery, to learn it from that way, to learn it in a sense from the bottom up. It's a craft and an art, and you learn that by doing it. And I think this is the same with writing. I think I'm not sure you can be taught it. I think you can be helped. So I'm not decrying creative writing courses. I think there are too many people on them and there are too many of them. Young people can go onto a creative writing course, indeed to read English, thinking that it will help them to become a writer. Well, I know many, many writers who went to study English and did it for a year and decided, no, all this is doing to me is telling me how wonderful other writers are, but my own...
Rather than developing, your
Absolutely, and so they go and do something completely different, physics, and that's brilliant. And that's training your mind in another way, but leaving the, if you like, the literature, the reading, as what it is that you're really interested in. And that's fine. And many, many great writers. I mean, if you think, for instance, of the huge numbers of great writers that have emerged from children's writers in particular, which is something that interests me a great deal, that have emerged from Oxford University. It's not an accident that Tolkien and Pullman and Lewis Carroll and these people all somehow have been around those wonderful buildings. There is an intensity about that, which certainly is important, and a tradition which is very important. But there's no recipe. There's no recipe.
Yeah. Your book, War Horse, was of course made into a huge film by Steven Spielberg. So what was it like collaborating with him on set?
I wouldn't call it collaborating, I call it visiting.
Visiting. Well, that's interesting. How much influence did you have in the creative sort of aspect of it?
I would say very little.
Right. Was that a problem?
No, not at the time. At the time, I thought, listen, this is Steven Spielberg. He makes quite decent movies. Who am I to worry about what film he's going to make? You know, I'd seen Saving Private Ryan and Schindler's List, and
yes,
you know, the man could make stories live on screen remarkably, and I was intrigued to see what he'd make of this. I did offer him some advice when I first met him, which was that the part of the story that was not in the First World War, that was not at the front, but was about England and pastoral England, particularly before the First World War, was critical to the story, because I wanted the characters that we followed through the war to be well grounded in their culture, in their place, in their work. That was really important to me. Okay. And I gave him a book, I remember, of photographs by a wonderful guy called James Revilius, who'd got a wonderful archive of photographs of Devon agricultural life before the First World War. And I said I wanted it to reflect this. It had to be dirty, and the boots had to be heavy, and the work had to be hard, and the lives had to be short. And although the cottages might look pretty, life was not pretty for them. And I think he listened, and we had really good talks. He's a wonderfully enthusiastic, warm, generous-hearted person, but I think he had already made up his mind as to what kind of a film this was going to be. He said to me at once when I went to see him on the set, and he was looking at some scene, he wanted me to look through his little sort of viewfinder thing. And he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "It's great." He said, "Yes, it's John Ford." And he just had John Ford in his head. And he wanted to make it an idyllic English landscape that Americans, I think, would recognize as being an idyllic English landscape. Right. In spite of the fact that I told them that it wasn't idyllic. So the disappointments were in that side of it. The war scenes were extraordinary. And I was thrilled it was made for all sorts of reasons. I mean, it's the book. I can tell you now. Before the film was made, it I think was in 4 or 5 languages. It's now in 48 languages. That's what the film did for it. But I have to say the thing that has affected it more than even the film has been the play. That's what's changed people's attitude really about the book of War Horse. I think when Spielberg makes a film, I think people forget the book. You know, they don't care, but they'll buy it. The publishers will do it because they'll know it'll be up there on hoardings. So in terms of sales, it's great. But the play did something much, much more. It gave great integrity to the book, which was wonderful.
It sounds as if you're almost happier with, I know can't make that comparison really, but perhaps more content with the depiction that the play had of your story than the film.
Totally, I'm glad you picked up on that. No, completely. I mean, it's a good film. It's just not a great film. And it could have been. You know, or we only needed to get some bits of it right. The National Theatre and Spielberg found it necessary, and I'm not quite sure why, but there's probably a fault in the book here. They both found it necessary to reinvent part of the story, which I think they weren't convinced by in the book. And that was the German part of the book.
Yeah.
So the German character in the book is a nice old guy called Friedrich, Mad Friedrich, and who I rather loved, but I think they all felt he was a little bit sentimental, and so they wanted to put some grit in there. So what Spielberg did was to create these 2 young men who decide to run away with the horses and desert and finally get shot. Okay. What they did, the National Theatre, was to make of the Germans 2 or 3 of them, one of whom was pretty sadistic and horrible, and the other who loved the horses. And they sort of slightly convoluted story in that, which sort of works but isn't, to my way of thinking, brilliant. Neither of the adaptations were brilliant, but I don't mind, because whenever I see the National Theatre production, in spite of the things that I stamp my foot and think, well, I would have done that differently, in its entirety, it has fantastic integrity and it has great, great power. It's a fantastic way to tell the story. The music, the puppets, obviously, the lighting, the design, there's a wonderful fusion of great, great talents making this thing work. And I've seen it in Germany, I just came back from seeing it in Holland, and all in different languages, and it works. For 80–90% of the audience, they think it's completely wonderful, and they get up and it stays. It's been on now for 7 months in Berlin, it's been on for 70 years in this country, and there must be something pretty good about it. It's just that being the originator, I do see the bits that are not glued together as well as I'd like to see it glued
and that's natural,
together.
isn't it?
It's completely natural, but they've done the most wonderful job. I mean, I'm so pleased and proud to be associated with it. I love going to see the actors, and wherever I go around the world, I go and talk to the actors, whether it's America or Germany or wherever. I talk to the actors about the First World War and about Devon, so they get some sense of the roots of all this. And they did something brilliant, the National. They got the Devon bit absolutely right. There's a real edge and harshness to the story they've created on the stage in Devon. And the atmosphere is that they make, the music in particular is quite extraordinary.
What would you change about Warhorse now, if you could, in terms of the story, in terms of your input?
Into the film or into the play or into my own book?
Into your own book.
I think if I'd been writing it now, I would have written it better. I tell you what it was, and they're right to change the bits that they changed. I think the bit at home, before they go, Albert and Joey growing up together has been done all right. That is because I'm so familiar with the place. The very fields he grew up in, I walk every day of my life. The church where he rings the bells, I've rung the bells there. The pub, it's all part of what I know. So the English bit's fine. The French bit's fine because I know France very, very well. It's a culture I know, it's a history I know, and I'm very pleased with the scenes there where Joey and Topthorne are resting, if you like, when they're not being used as war horses. I like that. The bit I had to graft at, to research at, was the German bit. I did go over to Germany. I did find out where, I did have a town where this Friedrich lived, but I'm not so immersed in it. So I think it was thinner. And when I read it now, I wish I'd been writing it 20 years later and have done that better. That's for sure.
Are there any other books of yours that you would like to see made into films?
About 20. And some have...
Give us one.
Well, some have been.
Oh yes, the ones that haven't been made into films.
Okay.
What ones do you reckon there should be, or you'd like to see?
My new book, which is coming out in September, I think is probably the most filmic book that I've written.
Did you have that in mind while writing?
No, I don't know why. I just saw it with enormous clarity.
And what's its title?
It's called Listen to the Moon. And it's the story of a child that survives the sinking of a ship called the Lusitania in 1915 off the south coast of Ireland. And the reason I wrote it is that there was a report by the Irish people rowing up to pick up survivors from this terrible tragedy, that they came across the piano from the dining room of the ship floating on the ocean, and lying on it, little girl. And it didn't say in the report that I read whether the girl was alive or dead. And I thought, hang on, I want to tell that girl's story. Why was she on the ship? Where was she going? And to me, it's an epic sort of film. It'll never be made because it'll cost too much money. But it's one of those films which is about a child who has a terrible trauma because she sees her mother drown. And she, because of that, cannot speak, and she doesn't know who she is. And she's discovered, I won't tell you how because you won't read the book, she's discovered somewhere, and the whole story is about how bit by bit her memory comes back and links herself to herself. So it has enormous potential. The other one that must be made into a film one day, there's two. One is called Alone on a Wide, Wide Sea. It's a journey really of a young boy from this country going all the way across the world, living his life, having a family, daughter, dying, and then the daughter sailing back to the UK to fulfill her father's last wish. And that again is very filmic. A lot of it takes place in the outback in Australia and at sea, and I would love that. And the last one would be The Amazing Story of Adolphus Tips, which is my version of events that took place in 1943 and 44 on Slapton Sands when the Americans came to practice their landings in Normandy, and the relationship between two black American GIs and a farming family in Devon. That's being made into a play by Knee-High.
Yes.
And you never know. I mean, Warhorse got made into a play first.
And then
Spielberg saw the play. He might come back to London and see the movie.
Now, I'm going to ask you what you think the best book you've ever written is, but I have seen you say before that it's the one that you've just written, it's fresh in your mind, you've experienced it for the last year, you know the characters, you're proud of it. But let's step back from Michael Morpurgo at the minute. How many books have you written?
I don't exactly, 130.
Your 130 books. Which one is your best?
Best, I think I do know. I think it's probably a book I wrote called Private Peaceful, the story of a soldier shot in the First World War. I think somehow the form of it and the manner in which it's told is probably about the best writing I've done. So I would say that's my best.
Okay.
It's not my favourite because I do read it. I read it in a concert performance with a wonderful group called Cook, Boys and Simpson, and I love doing it. But I do find it very painful to read again. I think that may be because it is well written compared to some of my other rubbish.
That's quite harsh, isn't it?
Well, I've written books. If you write 130 books, you can't get it right every time. I mean, it's very interesting, actually, this. I mean, it's very rare, I think, that writers get it right every time. Shakespeare wrote some plays which people don't want to perform very much, and we know why. They're really not very good. They really are not. They might have good things in it, but they're not very good as plays. And, there are one or two Mozart operas that you don't see performed with good reason. And one of the really good things about writing is it's a risk. Every time you start Once Upon a Time, you don't really know where you're going, and it's that risk that makes it fascinating. So when it does come off, to me there's a lot of good fortune involved. Whatever you've woven in seems to have really worked. But sometimes maybe you forced it a bit, you're so anxious to get it done, and then it goes wrong. So I think you have false moves, is the truth of it, and that's bound to be the case if you write a lot.
Most of your books are, I think, aimed at quite young readers. So you're a children's author, known as a children's author. So do you ever feel restricted in that sense that you know what you're writing on the page?
Yeah.
A lot of your readers are going to be quite young.
That would be the case if I wrote for them, but I don't. I think it's not consciously. I'm completely aware.
You don't consciously write for young people?
No, I just write. The reason I think they're thought of as children's books maybe is because the vast majority of them are about children. They're not for children, they're about children. Why are they about children? Because I was a child myself, that I do remember, and I've been a teacher or something to do with teaching all my working life. I know children really well. They really interest me. I don't like them all, but the way their take on the world, their spontaneity, I suppose, they're seeing things for the first time, they're coping, they're dealing with adults and with the world about them, finding their feet in the world really fascinates me. And I think that's why they're thought of as children's books. It may be also their length. I write quite short. I don't, always write great tranches, but I think why they work probably for children is that they're not written for children. The one thing that children really dislike, particularly intelligent children, and there are many, many millions of those, they hate being patronized. They hate it when they feel that someone is talking to them as if they're a child. And the lucky thing about having been a teacher and a father is that you learn pretty quickly not to talk to them like that. And I don't change my tone, even when I'm talking for, I know the book is going to be for very small children. I don't change my tone, I just do it. The publisher then comes along and says, well, Mike, you can't use that kind of stuff. And I have little arguments with my publishers who do say, well, isn't that sentence a bit complicated? Or will they understand that concept? And my reply is always that you have to weave somehow a degree of complexity of language and tone and story into a book, because otherwise how on earth are they ever going to climb the ladder of knowledge and understanding? So I don't write for them. I love it when they love the books, that's for sure.
Has Harry Potter, do you think, been good for literature?
Oh yeah, hugely. I think, frankly, anything that makes kids read, gets children reading, is wonderful. And that's been a genius thing, because for me it's not my taste in stories. I'm not brilliant with fantasy. I sort of can't cope with it. I'm the kind of reader who, in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, was really happy with the story until they walked through the back of a cupboard into another world. And I always thought, shut up, you know. I just don't go there, and I don't go there in my stories. But some children do. And millions of children did with Harry Potter. And that, you can be sure of it. There are millions of readers out there who first fell upon a Harry Potter and are now reading Jane Austen. Great.
And lastly, are you writing an autobiography?
Not an autobiography. I've had a biography written.
You have?
Yes, this is very because I didn't want an autobiography. I didn't want to do an autobiography.
You won't ever?
No, not at all. I'll tell you for why. I use my life massively in the stories that I write. I use the memory of my school days, my family, all sorts of things. They're woven in secretly into the stories that I write. I'm rather suspicious of autobiography in a way. Both my father and my stepfather wrote one each, and they're interesting, but all they are actually is that person's take on their own life. If I did that, I know it would be narrow. And why is that interesting? What seems to me to be interesting is when someone shines a different light on a life, one that you're not particularly aware of. And so I think 4 years ago now, I came across a wonderful biography of a Scottish poet called George Mackay Brown, written by Maggie Ferguson. And because my publishers had said, will you write an autobiography? And I'd said no, but I would consider having a biography done if I could ever find anyone who I thought would have integrity and be utterly trustworthy. I fell upon this book, thought it was brilliant, and we approached her to do it. And she brought in two versions. There's a version for grown-up children and a version for children. And she did a wonderful job. She examined the myths of my family, for instance, in a way I couldn't possibly. I'll give you an example. My Uncle Peter, who was the uncle killed in the Second World War in the RAF, I had been brought up, and everyone in my family, all my cousins, knew this story, that my Uncle Peter had been flying his plane over France or wherever, and it had been hit by flak or whatever, and he was coming back, and two people had been killed, two were alive, I think, and the pilot had been so badly wounded he couldn't land the plane. And my uncle was a navigator, not a pilot, and being, the myth went, a wonderful man and extraordinarily brave, he took the controls of the plane and tried to land it. And he failed, and they all died, except that he did something rather wonderful beforehand. The two men were told to jump out, and they survived, but the pilot who'd been wounded was killed along with Uncle Peter. That's the story. So I would have written that. That's what I would have written. What does Maggie do? Maggie rings up the RAF, finds out his squadron, goes to squadron records, and finds out where he was stationed and exactly what happened. And what does she discover? That plane took off and crashed on takeoff, killing everyone. There is no story of heroism. But within the family, I think in order to somehow deal with his death, someone must have rung up from the station and said he was a very brave man, he was always very heroic, and bit by bit by bit.
Chinese whispers. Perhaps.
It's exactly that. And that's what's interesting about lives. They're full of Chinese whispers, and it needs someone else, someone with huge integrity, to somehow pare away the myths and get back. The myths are interesting, but to get back to some truths. And she, it's not entirely comfortable for me to read it. I don't mind that. I think it tells me more about myself than I knew before, and I'd never have had that if I'd written my own autobiography. So I'm not going to do it, no.
Michael, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Nice to speak to you.
Really hope you enjoyed this interview with Michael Morpurgo. He's kindly signed a special hardback copy of his famous book Warhorse, and we want to give this away to a random viewer. All you have to do is tweet a link to this video. Just go on Twitter, share it, and at the end of July, we'll post it to one of those people.